Assalamu alaikum everyone, and welcome to our next class. And today we are going to talk about speaking, and specifically we'll be trying to look at the speaking test from the examiner's perspective, right? Trying to cover different things that the examiner wants to see in your performance and certain things that you need to avoid, right, in order to get a higher score. And I'll be your teacher. My name is Dilmurod Nazarmatov. I've been working in this IELTS industry for several years at the Druzhba branch of Everest. The lesson will be divided into two parts, and in each case we'll be dealing with two different aspects of the IELTS speaking test, right? So let's dive straight into it. So the first criteria, right? Criterion being something that the examiners use to measure how well you're speaking. So the first criterion is fluency and coherence. And naturally we are going to divide it into two. So first let's look at fluency. It means a lot of things, but the gist of it, right, the most important thing is your ability to speak fluently, meaning your ability to speak without too many pauses and extending your answers, right? And in fact, that's one of the problems that some candidates might have at lower levels, and we call these short turns, right? When the examiner asks you a question, it's usually better to speak a little too much than speaking a little too little, right? So that's the thing. So we want to extend our answers, and the examiner wants to move on. They can always do that by asking the next question, and obviously you will respect them, and then the moment they start talking, you want to stay silent. And the next aspect of fluency is hesitation. Hesitation is when you are stopping, right? It can be in different forms. Some people just stop and pause silently, but some people have this habit of using fillers, you know, and then you have these fillers, right? So all these things are different forms of hesitation, and they are not always bad, right? Because sometimes we have to stop, not because we are having difficulty with the language, but because we are trying to find some ideas. Imagine, for example, in part 2, you are telling this very nice story, and at some point you have to stop and gather your thoughts to think about what you'd like to say next. And that's completely fine. The examiners are well trained, and they can see that you're not struggling, right? You're not having difficulty with the language. So that's content-related hesitation, and this is not going to affect your score. But on the other hand, if you stop trying to find some words, right, or recall a certain grammatical structure, then this is going to affect your fluency score. Let's imagine a candidate trying to use if conditionals, right, which are very tricky. So they go like if, and then they stop. So I shouldn't use will, right? Which one do I use? Do I use the past simple? Do I use the past perfect? So the examiner can clearly see that you are trying not to make any mistakes with the conditional, and therefore this is going to affect your fluency score, especially if you do that too many times. The same can happen with words, right? Imagine you are describing something and then you want to say something like this artificial hair, right? In Uzbek we call it parik, probably that's a Russian word anyways. So, right, you're saying she was wearing, and then you stop because you don't know the word, and the examiner can clearly see that this is the problem, and again your score will be affected. So pauses are not always bad, but if you're pausing for grammar mistakes or for maybe vocabulary problems, then this is something to worry about. The next component of fluency is self-repetition, right? Repeating yourself. Sometimes people do this. I think people are, and it's very difficult for them to say the whole sentence in one go. And this creates a problem because the listener might get distracted very easily, and that's not something we want to have. And a similar problem is self-correction, right? So in this case, you're not necessarily repeating the same thing. Instead, you're saying something, and then you're like, oh my God, I've made a mistake. I don't want to lose points for grammar, for example, so I'll repeat, right? But correct myself. So I can say, he go to blah, blah, and then I remember, oh my God, I have to say he goes, right? So I have to say he goes, right? And this happens a lot to most students. Sometimes this happens because of pronunciation mistakes, right? Imagine you mistakenly say floor, right? You know it's pronounced floor, but for some reason you said floor and then you say floor, a floor. But again, creates some problems with fluency. So preferably we want to minimize that. If you do these things once or twice, perhaps you're not going to get a very low score, but too many times, now that is a real problem. And then the second component of fluency and coherence was coherence. Now, coherence, what does that mean? In short, it is how easy is it for the listener to understand what you're saying, right? If I'm very clear, right, for example, now you are watching this video, and if you can easily listen to me and then understand my ideas, then my speech is very, very coherent, right? If not, then there are certain things I need to work on. Now, what are we going to consider in this case? Well, first of all, as everybody usually talks about, we have cohesive devices, right? Words and phrases that keep everything together, linking ideas, right? And making it easier for the listener to follow us. For example, now I just used it, for example, so now you know that an example will follow. Or you might say, on top of that, right? Showing that you are going to move on from one argument to the next one. So these are the things that we need to use correctly, but of course it's important not to overuse them, right? I don't want to use them all the time at the beginning of every sentence, and certainly I don't want to make mistakes while using those, right? So I should know exactly what I am doing. For example, some students learn moreover, right, in their task 2 essays, and they're like, oh my god, that's a great linking word. And it is great, but for task 2 writing. However, it's not very well suited for speaking, right? Especially in parts 1 and 2. It's just too formal, right? We don't say, there are lots of hobbies I enjoy, I like tennis, moreover. No, that's not how you succeed. If you do that, you are going to lose some points, right? So we want to use a range, right? A different kind of cohesive devices and use them correctly. And the next part of coherence is how you organize your speech, right? Is that in a logical order, and are you speaking clearly? For example, imagine someone asks me whether I like sports, right? And if I come to them and say, yeah, as you can see, I really love sport. Now that's a problem because you can't really see why I would like sport, right? I'm quite thin, right? I'm not necessarily this muscular macho, right? And therefore it creates a confusion, right? The listener might say, what exactly should I see, right? Okay, I see your face, I see your body, but you don't strike me as someone who is very sporty, right? Who's been doing sport for a long time. So we want to avoid any questions, or we don't want to leave the listener with any questions. Let's put it that way. So that is fluency and coherence, and the natural question is, how do we improve? Yes, Dilmurod, I can see that I'm stopping a lot, right? Trying to recall some words, trying to put the grammar in the right order, and I'm trying not to say but again still I'm using these fillers all the time. I'm not always clear. Well, I think it all starts first by first you answering some questions and recording your answers, and then once you listen to those, you can maybe make a note of those most common problems, right? If you make a certain mistake once, but make one mistake 15 times, obviously you want to start with the bigger problem, right? And how do we work on that? Well, it usually comes down to the reason why you have, for example, fluency problems. If you're just saying the solution is simple. You try not to do that, right? This is as simple as that, right? If I say all the time, I need to learn how to stay quiet. And as you can see, pauses cannot necessarily create problems, right? For example, I don't think you are bothered by the pauses I have in my speech. Right, and then sometimes you have problems with grammar, and therefore you need to slow down and think about things. Or maybe sometimes you make mistakes and then correct yourself. Let's imagine you are one of those guys who doesn't know how to use the past simple, right? So you say, I go to the museum and we buy some blah blah at the shop. Now, obviously, you want to start practicing with the past simple specifically, so that even when you are talking without thinking much, you start using the tense correctly, right? It's not going to happen overnight in 1 day or in 2 days, but if you keep practicing, maybe for a week, right? Try to have a list of things you want to work on, and at the end of each day, or maybe even at the beginning, try to improve those aspects, right? Making some 5 sentences for the past simple, both positive and negative, and maybe even questions. And that's how you steadily, right, but gradually improve your speaking. And the similar thing can happen in vocabulary, right? You kind of understand the words when you see them, when you listen to words, you can understand what they mean, but once you start talking, those words will disappear, right? And this is what we call active versus passive vocabulary. It's just that when you learned words, you didn't learn or you didn't practice to speak those, to speak using those words or to write things using those words. Instead, you just try to understand them in reading passages and in listening tests. And obviously, a good starting point is for you to cover different topics and see which words might be difficult for you to remember. And once you do that, right, you'll find, okay, so I can't remember this easily, I can't remember this easily. And then you start making sentences using those, and then start adding those to your active vocabulary. Again, takes time, but again, language learning is a difficult and a long process. Now, and then for lexical resource, this is an area that a lot of people are particularly concerned about, right? Whenever I see a student, they will be trying to learn these cool, fancy words, and that's not a bad thing. But it becomes bad if you don't know how to use those cool, fancy words. Because if you look at the band descriptors, this official document that the examiners use to give you different scores, you can see that candidates beyond band 7, so if you want to get a 7, 8, or 9, you need to use this less common vocabulary and idiomatic expressions. What do we mean by less common? Basically, these are words that, imagine you have a test with 100 candidates. And among these, a lot of people could easily use things like bus, right, or cars or transportation, but fewer people will use vehicles, right? Now we are already trying to stand out, right, in some way. So these are examples of less common vocabulary. And idiomatic expressions don't necessarily mean proverbs, maqollar bo'lishi shart emas. Instead, we are talking about things that native speakers would naturally use in different contexts. For example, instead of face-to-face, maybe you can say in person, or instead of kind, in some cases, you can use sympathetic. And notice I'm saying in some cases because I know that sympathetic and kind are not always the same things, right? And therefore, you need to learn words thoroughly, right? Learn them really well and see when exactly these are used. And then when we are using these examples of less common vocabulary, we also need to use those with awareness of collocation and style. Collocation means words that go together and sound natural. For example, in Uzbek, we can say guppa guppa qor yog'di, but we don't say guppa guppa yomg'ir yog'di, right? So these two words or phrases cannot come together. Or when we mean somebody is lying in Uzbek, we can say quloqqa tepyapti, but we don't say yuzimizga tepyapti, right? Again, there is no clear reason why the second option is worse. It's just that we, native speakers of Uzbek, know that it is more natural to say quloqqa tepyapti, not yuziga tepyapti. And that's exactly what happens in English. For example, imagine you are talking about an exam and you passed and then you felt happy. So you can say, I was over the moon when I passed. Over the moon is a very nice phrase, right, to use, and it shows how happy you were. But if you say, I experienced a feeling of extreme happiness upon passing. Now notice these are not widely used words. For example, extreme happiness, right, or upon, right? This is not a preposition you will hear a lot in many people's speech. But the problem with that is this example is rather too formal, and therefore it shows that we don't really know what style, right, we need to use in the IELTS speaking exam. It's just like entering a classroom, right, in Uzbek, and say, ma'zur tutasiz, right? You don't say ma'zur tutasiz, you say kechirasiz, uzur ustoz, right? You don't say ma'zur tutasiz. And this can clearly show the difference between words that mean the same thing but are used in different styles, right? So the same happens in English as well, where we also talked about collocation. And sometimes we can say deeply concerned, right, to replace very. There are lots of popular videos on Instagram, for example, right? Don't use very, use these words instead. And they're not wrong, but what they usually miss is they don't tell you when those synonyms can be used, right? For example, deeply, highly, extremely, utterly, right? Because you can't always say, I am utterly happy, but you can say, I'm very happy, right? So again, bit by bit, step by step, you'll need to learn all these collocations. I don't think there is a shortcut. There is a shorter path to becoming a good speaker of English. So we can say deeply concerned, or we can say highly effective. But if you try to switch those, you can't say highly concerned or deeply effective. So this is not going to work. The examiner will understand you, but again, they will look at you and say, okay, so you used this nice word, but you didn't show this awareness of collocation, and you're not going to get a 7, for example, for fluency and for lexical resource if you keep making these mistakes. If you do that once, probably you are fine, but if like 5, 6 times, then the examiner might reconsider giving you a 7. Now, what else do we consider for lexical resource? If you are aiming at bands 8 or 9, now you need to show not just this unusual vocabulary in correct styles and used with correct words, but you also need to show some ability to use paraphrase, right? Instead of repeating the word patient, 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 you want to say something like lose my patience, at least using it as a noun, or maybe sometimes using tolerate, right, in different contexts, again, as a very nice synonym for patience. Or sometimes you can just say, I can usually wait and don't mind it, blah, 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 right? I avoided the word. So these skills are required for the highest levels, but if we are being realistic, most students are going to be super happy with band 7 for speaking, and therefore this is what you need, right? Not necessarily trying too hard to paraphrase everything, but if you can, of course, this is a nice thing to have. And the question about lexical resource, like how do we improve lexical resource? Again, the answers are going to be quite simple. First of all, I'll need you to listen to a lot of English content. And if you really want to improve your speaking skills, preferably maybe about 70 to 80% of what you're listening to should be clear, but the remaining 20% or so should be new, so that you are an active listener, right? You are really paying attention. And usually, because of your existing knowledge, you can easily understand those words in context, right? And that's how we usually learn how to speak. And you can also do the same thing with reading, but the problem there is while you are reading, you don't know how certain things are pronounced, right? So you might need to consult a dictionary and then check the pronunciation. And it's also important, like we said earlier, to learn vocabulary correctly. So when you are learning consist, you don't learn it in isolation, right? You don't say consist, ibarat bo'lmoq. Okay, so can I say this book consists 10 sections, right? And if you don't know how to use the word correctly, that's what you might end up saying. Or even worse, you will say, consist. Is that a verb or a noun or an adjective, right? And then you might say, this book is, consists, and whatever, right? So, but if you learned it correctly, you will know consist comes with of, right? So this is the collocation, consist of something. So this book consists of 10 sections, right? So this is how we want to learn words. Or like we said, if you are learning utterly, you should learn that utterly is usually used with negative things, right? Utterly disappointed, right? I was very disappointed. I was utterly disappointed. But again, I have this question of like, is utterly a bit too formal for speaking, right? Maybe a bit old-fashioned, right? So these are the things we need to be learning, and for that, when I learn new words, I try to check them in maybe 2-3 different dictionaries and then see what kind of sentences they can be used in. Or even better, when you are, for example, watching something or listening to something, you can already know what style people are likely to use. For example, if you are watching a certain historical drama, then the chances are what you learn from there might not be readily used in speaking. For example, splendid, right? This was a very common expression back in the day to mean beautiful, to mean great, right? You're splendid. But I wouldn't use the same word today because the language changes over time and native speakers don't use this word as frequently. And it's also important to cover a range of topics so that you don't end up talking about one topic really well, right? Maybe you are an expert in chocolate production, so you know all sorts of words to describe chocolate, its flavor, its production, and then preferences, the reasons for its popularity, and so on. But once you exit this topic, right, and then start talking about maybe the weather or flowers, right, then you don't want to show this big difference. You want to stay consistent in order to get a high score. Yes. So at this point, our first part of the speaking discussion is going to end, and I hope you've benefited from this short video. And in the next video, we are going to cover 2 more criteria, those being pronunciation and then grammatical range and accuracy. And I am pretty sure that in pronunciation there will be a lot to learn, so make sure to watch the second video as well.